My name is Eleanor, but people call me Ellie, and I'm 64 years old. I have lived long enough to know the difference between words spoken in love and words spoken in greed. That afternoon, at what should have been a joyful family gathering, I heard the kind that cut deep. My grandson James, 27, handsome, full of charm for anyone but me, breezed right past without a hello. His hand was wrapped around his girlfriend's, his voice raised loud enough for the whole dining room to hear. "One day this mansion will be mine anyway," he bragged, flashing her a smile as though I were nothing more than a ghost in the corner. The laughter that followed was worse than silence. No one corrected him. No one reminded him who had paid the mortgage with years of sacrifice, who had patched these walls with tired hands, who had filled every room with the warmth of love. I sat still, a polite smile hiding the ache in my chest. It wasn't the mansion that broke my heart. It was the way James spoke, as though my life, my love, my sacrifices meant nothing, as though I were already gone. He thought this mansion was mine. He was wrong. And when the truth came out, so was he, because this house was never just walls and windows. It was respect. It was legacy. And soon, James would learn what it meant to lose both. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. If stories like this one resonate with you, hit subscribe. I've always lived a quiet life. After retiring as a librarian, I slipped into a rhythm that suited me perfectly. My days are steady, marked by small rituals that give me comfort. Every morning I wake early, put the kettle on, and take my tea to the kitchen table that looks out over the garden. I've planted roses along the path, and in spring they spill with color, reminding me that even after loss, life blooms again. I've been a widow for 15 years. My husband Richard was gentle and patient, and though I still miss him, I've grown used to being alone. The mansion I live in now is grander than anything Richard and I ever dreamed of. People in the village call it the Whitfield house. They assume it belongs to me, but the truth is more complicated. The mansion actually belonged to my sister Margaret. She never married and had no children, so when she passed, everyone expected she'd leave it to me. But Margaret was a practical woman with a strong sense of purpose. Her will left the mansion in trust, destined one day to serve as a charity home for families in need. I was allowed to live here until my death, but I knew from the start it would never be mine to give away. That never troubled me. I've never cared about ownership. Walls and deeds matter less than the love carried inside them. Still, people assume. They see me tending the gardens, carrying shopping through the grand front doors, and they believe the house belongs to me. My grandson James is one of them. He grew up playing hide and seek in its wide hallways and football on the back lawn. To him, it always looked like a treasure waiting to be inherited. James came into my care when he was only 5. His parents, my daughter and her husband, were struggling at the time. Too much debt, too many arguments. I stepped in quietly, the way grandmothers do, without ever making a fuss. I packed school lunches, tied his shoelaces, and taught him how to read. On Sundays, I roasted chicken with potatoes, and we'd sit at the long dining table, just the two of us. He used to tell me everything about school, about his friends, even about the silly cartoons he loved. He clung to me as though I was the only constant in his world. I still remember walking him to school, his little hand gripping mine. Some mornings he'd drag his feet, pretending to be tired, just so I'd carry his backpack. Other times he'd skip ahead, shouting for me to hurry. Back then, he was my shadow, and I was proud to be his anchor. The years passed quickly. Children grow, and so do their opinions. By the time James was a teenager, I could sense a distance forming. He rolled his eyes at my reminders about manners. He avoided inviting friends over, embarrassed by what he called my old-fashioned ways. When I mentioned books I thought he'd enjoy, he brushed me off with, "No one reads anymore, Grandma." I told myself it was just the usual teenage storm, that he'd circle back in time. But instead, the gap widened. He grew taller, sharper in his words, more absorbed in his own world. When he came by, he spent more time on his phone than speaking to me. And slowly, the boy who once begged me to sit beside him at bedtime seemed to forget I'd ever been central in his life. Still, I kept the memories. On my bookshelf sits a photo album I made during his childhood. The cover is a little faded now, the corners bent from years of handling. Inside are pictures of James as a gap-toothed boy holding his first school certificate, James building sandcastles on the beach, James asleep on the sofa with a book sliding from his hand. These images remind me of the bond we shared, even if he no longer remembers it in the same way. The album gathers dust, but I cannot bring myself to put it away. Another item I keep close is a set of keys to the mansion. They jingle lightly in my drawer whenever I open it, a reminder of both access and responsibility. People think keys mean ownership, but they don't. For me, they symbolize trust. Margaret's trust that I would live here respectfully, and the charity's trust that I would protect it until the time came to pass it on. Every time I hold them, I remember the truth. I am only a caretaker, not the true heir. Then there's the letter. It came from Margaret's solicitor not long after her passing, outlining her wishes in careful language. The paper has yellowed slightly over the years, but I know every line by heart. It states that upon my death, the mansion will revert fully to the Whitfield family trust. The home will become a sanctuary for families without one, just as Margaret intended. I keep the letter tucked in a drawer beneath the tea towels. Sometimes I pull it out and reread it, especially when people speak as though the mansion is my possession. It helps me stay grounded in the truth. I've never been one to measure my worth by bricks and mortar. Love has always been the currency that mattered. When I think of my happiest moments, they're not tied to property, but to people. Richard's laughter in the garden, James's small voice reading a bedtime story, Margaret humming as she cooked beside me. Those are the treasures that endure. And yet, as James grew into a man, he seemed to forget this lesson. He began to equate love with inheritance, respect with material gain. I saw it in the way he glanced around the house with pride, as if its grandeur reflected him more than me. He spoke of, "when the house is mine," with a casual certainty that pierced my heart. I never corrected him outright. Perhaps I should have. Perhaps I let silence build a false foundation beneath his feet. But part of me hoped he would one day realize that family bonds are deeper than deeds and that my love was not tied to property. So I lived quietly, tending the roses, making tea, and carrying on as best I could. Outwardly, everything looked serene. Inwardly, though, I carried the ache of being slowly pushed aside by the very boy I once raised. The foreshadowing was there, even if I chose not to see it. The more James grew attached to the idea of inheriting the mansion, the less attached he seemed to me. And that, perhaps, was the greatest sorrow of all. The breaking point came one evening at a family dinner. I had been invited to my daughter's house, a modest place compared to the mansion, but warm and full of noise. The table was crowded with dishes, roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, vegetables tossed in butter. Relatives chatted, glasses clinked, laughter rose in bursts. For a while, I sat quietly, just grateful to be surrounded by family, even if my presence sometimes felt like an afterthought. James arrived late, as he often did. He walked in with an air of confidence, his girlfriend at his side, both of them dressed sharply, as if they were heading to a party rather than a family meal. He kissed his mother's cheek, gave his father a distracted nod, and barely acknowledged me. I waited for him to settle before asking gently, "How have you been, James? I haven't heard from you in a while." He smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Still the same, Grandma, clingy as ever, always wanting updates." The table chuckled politely, but my face flushed. He meant it as a joke, but the sting went deeper. I looked down at my plate, pushing a pea across the china. I told myself not to let it rattle me, but my heart squeezed in my chest. That little boy who once used to run into my arms now dismissed me as though I were a nuisance. As the evening wore on, James grew louder. He dominated the table with stories of nights out, business ventures, and travel plans. His words carried bravado, but underneath I could hear the hunger for admiration. He wanted to impress, and he knew exactly which subject would draw gasps. Leaning forward, he tapped his glass with a spoon. "You all know, don't you? One day, the mansion will be mine. And when it is, I'm going to throw the grandest parties this family has ever seen. No more dusty dinners. We'll have champagne flowing, music in every room, the works." His friends, people I barely recognized, laughed and clapped him on the back. My chest tightened. It wasn't the parties that troubled me. It was the way he spoke, as though the house was already his, as though I were invisible, just a shadow occupying space until he could step into it. I excused myself to fetch water, hoping to gather my composure. On the way back from the kitchen, I paused near the hallway where voices carried. James was speaking to a cousin in a low tone, but I caught every word. "Grandma doesn't really need it anymore," he said with a shrug. "It'll be mine when she's gone." The words landed like a stone in my stomach. Not a whisper of love, not a hint of gratitude, just cold certainty that my life was little more than an obstacle between him and what he believed was his due. I stood frozen in that hallway, gripping the glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. My ears buzzed. I wanted to step forward, to correct him, to tell him the truth about the house, but I couldn't. My throat was tight, my dignity trembling, so I walked back to the table, sat in silence, and ate without tasting a bite. When dinner finally ended, I slipped away before anyone could notice my tears. The drive home was long, the roads dimly lit, the fields outside blurred by darkness. My hands clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white. His words echoed again and again, "She doesn't need it anymore." Not once did he speak of me as his grandmother, as the woman who raised him, who sat beside him on cold mornings tying his shoelaces. He didn't see me. He saw a stepping stone to wealth, a placeholder keeping his mansion warm until he could claim it. When I arrived home, I went straight to the kitchen drawer and pulled out the letter from Margaret's solicitor. The envelope was worn, the crease soft from years of opening and closing, but the words inside were clear. The mansion was never mine to give. It belonged to the trust, destined for a greater purpose. I sat at the table, the letter spread before me, my tea growing cold. For the first time, I realized the depth of James's delusion. He had built his future on a lie, one I had never corrected, and now the truth pressed on my chest like a weight I could hardly bear. That night, sleep never came, only the relentless thought, he doesn't know. He has no idea the mansion isn't his at all. The days following that family dinner stretched like shadows across my life. I could not silence James's words, nor the smug way he'd spoken about the mansion as if it were already his. I told myself not to dwell, that I was too old to brood over such things. But when silence fell in the house at night, his voice would rise again in my memory, repeating that awful sentence, "She doesn't need it anymore." And then I began to notice a pattern, one I'd been too willing, perhaps too hopeful, to overlook before. James rarely came to see me unless there was something he wanted. Sometimes it was money for a new venture, other times a request to borrow the car, or even, once, to host friends in the garden as though the estate were a public park. When he left, he hardly ever said goodbye. My birthday came and went that year without so much as a card from him. I tried to hide my disappointment by telling myself that young people have busy lives. But I noticed he had plenty of time for social events, vacations, and long weekends away with friends. At Christmas, while the rest of the family gathered for carols and a simple supper, James didn't appear. He posted pictures on social media instead, smiling in some glittering restaurant, his arms slung casually around his girlfriend, champagne in hand. Yet, curiously, he always seemed to have time for the mansion. I started keeping count. 3 times in 1 month, the neighbors told me they had seen James pulling up in his sleek black car, girlfriend beside him. Once, he lingered in the drive as though showing off the architecture, his hand sweeping dramatically across the roofline. He was saying something about how he'd take over soon, one neighbor confided gently, clearly embarrassed to be passing along gossip. But I could see the pity in her eyes. Another time, I spotted him from the upstairs window, leading a group of friends along the stone path that wound through the garden. He moved like a host already in possession, gesturing toward the fountain, pointing out the ivy-covered balconies. My stomach turned as I watched him press the brass door handle with the ease of entitlement, ushering them inside as if I were the guest in my own home. I wanted to confront him, but I hesitated. Anger rose in me, yes, but so did sorrow. For all my years, for all my patience, what had I raised in this boy? The questions gnawed at me, so one afternoon I fetched the old leather box from the back of my closet. Inside were Margaret's papers, documents, letters, the fragile threads of the truth I had kept tucked away. My fingers shook as I unfolded the will once again, Though I had read it dozens of times before, it was all there in black ink, signed and sealed decades ago. The mansion was not truly mine. It belonged to the family trust. I had been granted life residency, a place to dwell until my days were done, but the deed itself was beyond my hand to give away. At my passing, the trust would reclaim it, directing it toward causes Margaret had named: scholarships, community support, restoration projects. She had been deliberate, meticulous, wanting her legacy to extend beyond the family. I sighed, my breath rattling in the quiet room. I loved the house deeply. It had been my shelter, my joy, the setting for so many memories. But I had never been under any illusion that it was mine to bestow. James, however, had built his whole vision of the future upon that false belief. The letter trembled in my hands as I folded it back into the envelope. I placed it on the table beside me, the truth staring up with an unblinking gaze. Later that evening, I wandered into my bedroom. On my nightstand sat the keys, heavy brass, polished from years of use. They rested in a neat ring, the very symbol James seemed to covet. Whenever he visited, his eyes always darted toward them, as though they were a crown waiting to be claimed. I picked them up, feeling the cool weight in my palm. To me, they meant responsibility, memory, and duty. To him, they meant possession, parties, and pride. Setting them back on the table, I stared for a long while. The thought crept in, uninvited but insistent. James believes these keys open a kingdom that belongs to him. But what they truly unlock is a truth that may shatter him. The days went on, and the distance between us widened. James never once asked about my health, though my hands ached with arthritis and my steps had slowed. He never inquired about my happiness, though the nights grew lonely in the sprawling rooms. Not once did he place a hand on my shoulder and ask, "How are you, Grandma?" All he asked about, again and again, was the house. When could he bring people over? Could he host a dinner? Could he take photos for a portfolio he was curating? The mansion had become, in his eyes, not a home but a prize, and I was simply the inconvenient gatekeeper. Each request, each boast, each careless remark tightened the knot in my chest. I had hoped that one day James would see me for who I was, not for what I lived in. But instead, with every passing week, he revealed how little my heart mattered to him. The tension grew unbearable. I found myself lying awake at night, the letter tucked in its envelope beside my bed, the keys gleaming softly in the lamplight. They became a symbol, almost a curse. I would stare at them, wondering if James dreamt of them as much as I did. And beneath it all, an unease stirred like a storm on the horizon. For secrets have a way of clawing into the light, and I knew the day would come when James would learn the truth. The question that haunted me was not if he would find out, but how. It happened one Sunday afternoon, after the church bells had faded and the garden was heavy with the scent of lavender. James had stopped by without warning, striding into the kitchen as though the house already belonged to him. His girlfriend waited in the car, engine running, while he leaned against the counter, idly scrolling through his phone. I poured him a cup of tea anyway, though he didn't touch it. My hands trembled just slightly as I set the porcelain down. For days, I had wrestled with the weight of silence. Perhaps it was kinder to tell him now, gently, before his delusions rooted too deep. "James," I said softly, "there's something I need you to understand." He glanced up, distracted, his brow furrowed as though he had somewhere more important to be. "You know," I continued, choosing my words carefully, "the mansion? It isn't really mine to give." For a moment, he blinked, as if the meaning hadn't landed. Then a grin spread across his face, quick and dismissive. He chuckled, waving a hand. "Of course it is, Grandma. Don't be silly. You live here. Everyone knows it'll be mine one day." His tone was so light, so sure, that it pierced deeper than anger ever could. He didn't even consider my words, didn't pause to think, to ask, to wonder if I might be speaking truth. He brushed them away like dust on his sleeve. I tried again, more firmly. "No, James. It was your Aunt Margaret's. It belongs to the trust she set up. I'm only allowed to live here until—" My voice faltered on the edge of the word death. "Until I'm gone." But he was already shaking his head, smirking. "You worry too much. Trusts, wills, lawyers, all paperwork. What matters is you're here now, and when you're gone, it'll all pass to me. That's how family works. Family. The word struck me like a stone. Did he truly believe inheritance was the measure of kinship? I searched his eyes, hoping for a flicker of understanding. But what I saw chilled me, stubborn certainty, maybe even denial. He didn't believe me, or perhaps he refused to. To him, the mansion was not a gift that might or might not be his. It was already his by right, carved into his vision of the future. In that moment, my heart clenched, not because the house would never be his, but because my words had never touched him. Not once did he ask why I was telling him this, or how it made me feel, or what Margaret's wishes had been. He was deaf to the truth because it wasn't the truth he wanted. I let the silence fall between us, thick and heavy. He checked his phone again, muttered something about meeting friends, and stood to leave. The tea I'd poured sat untouched, its steam curling away until the cup grew cold. When the door closed behind him, the house seemed to exhale. I sat for a long time at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where he'd lounged so carelessly. That was when my eyes drifted to the bookshelf. The old photo album, edges frayed with age, sat where it always had, gathering dust. I reached for it, pulling it into my lap. The leather cracked as I opened it, and there he was. James, a little boy in overalls, grinning wide with jam smeared on his cheeks. Another page, James at 5, holding my hand as we crossed the schoolyard. Another, curled in my lap while I read him. The wind in the willows, his small fingers clinging to mine as though I were his entire world. I traced those tiny hands on the page, remembering the warmth of them, the way he once leaned into me for comfort. That boy had loved me. Not the house, not the land, not the future, but me. Tears blurred the photographs as the realization sank deep into my bones. The boy I had raised was gone, replaced by a man who saw me only as the gatekeeper to stone and brick. My love had become invisible, drowned out by the mansion's grandeur. And so, the painful truth settled over me like a shroud. James did not value me. He valued what he believed I could leave behind. The keys on the nightstand, the letter in the drawer, the photo album in my lap. They told a story far heavier than any will could carry. A story of love given freely, and of love unreturned. It began slowly at first, the way weeds creep through cracks in the pavement. James's visits became more frequent, though never out of kindness. He arrived with tape measures, sketch pads, and a restless energy that made the air around him hum. One Saturday, I watched from the drawing room window as he paced the grounds with his girlfriend, gesturing broadly to the gardens I had tended for years. His voice carried across the lawn. "We'll put a pool here," he said, sweeping his arm toward the roses Margaret had planted decades ago. "And that side wing? Perfect for a gym. This place is wasted as it is." His girlfriend laughed, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. "You'll make it amazing. I can't wait to move in. Move in." The words sliced through me like a blade. They spoke as though I were already gone, as though my presence in the house was merely an inconvenience delaying their future. Inside, I set my teacup down with deliberate calm, though my hands trembled. I told myself it was only idle talk, youthful arrogance. But each visit piled on more evidence. He began introducing the mansion to his friends as my place. He boasted about upcoming parties, about renovations, about his legacy. Once, at a neighbor's gathering, I overheard him say, "Grandma's just keeping it warm for me. Give it a few years and it'll be ours." The casual cruelty of it made my stomach turn. That night, when he came by again, I could no longer hold my silence. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had fed him Sunday roasts as a boy. The same table where I'd taught him to read. "James," I began, my voice firmer than I expected, "why do you never call unless it's about the house?" He looked up from his phone, irritation flickering across his face. "What are you talking about?" "I mean it," I pressed. "You don't ask about my health. You don't come for tea or to tell me about your work or your life. Every word you speak is about this house. About what you'll do with it." For a heartbeat, his expression hardened. Then, with a sharpness that left me breathless, he snapped, "Because that's all that matters. The house is the legacy, Grandma. You're just the bridge to it." Silence. It rang louder than any outburst. His words hung in the air, jagged and cruel, echoing in the space where love used to live. I swallowed, my dignity crumbling beneath the weight of his bluntness. I had raised him, held him when he cried, walked him to school, patched his scraped knees. And now, to him, I was nothing but a stepping stone, a placeholder until the bricks and mortar passed to his name. I wanted to shout, to tell him the full truth, that the house was never mine to give, that he was building castles in the air. But something stopped me. A fear, perhaps, of shattering the last thread between us. If I told him, would he hate me? Would he walk out and never return, severing even the faint illusion of family? That night, long after he had stormed off, I sat alone in my room with the letter from Margaret spread across my lap. Her handwriting curved across the page, elegant and steady. Our family's strength is in love, not walls of stone. I read those words again and again until the ink blurred. Margaret had known the truth all along. She had understood that houses crumble, gardens wither, but love, if tended, endures. Yet here I was, holding keys that meant nothing but confusion and greed. James saw them as a crown, a guarantee. I saw them for what they were: temporary guardianship, a trust, a weight I carried on behalf of Margaret's wishes. I placed the keys on my nightstand, staring at their cold gleam in the lamplight. They seemed heavier than iron, as though they bore the burden of every word James had spoken. Inside me, a storm churned. Should I confront him fully, tear away the veil and force him to face the truth? Or should I wait, let time deliver its lesson? Perhaps one day, when the house slipped from his grasp, he would finally understand that love mattered more than stone walls and manicured lawns. But another thought crept in, one darker, sharper. By keeping silent, was I allowing him to trample over my dignity? Was I letting his arrogance diminish the love I had given him? I pressed my hands together, whispering into the quiet, "Margaret, what would you have me do?" No answer came, only the rustle of the curtains as the night wind pushed against the glass. In that moment, I realized I was standing at a crossroads. On one path, silence protecting him from the truth, but sacrificing my dignity. On the other, confrontation risking his anger, but reclaiming my voice. For days, I carried the weight of that choice. Every creak of the old house, every photograph on the walls, seemed to echo the question. The photo album on the shelf whispered of the boy who once clung to me with love. The keys glinted with the reminder of his ambition, and Margaret's letter, folded and refolded, held the truth that I could not ignore forever. One evening, as I watered the roses, I heard James's laughter drift across the lawn. He was showing his girlfriend the orchard, telling her how they'd host weddings here once they took over. The arrogance in his voice pierced me again, but this time it no longer left me silent. I knew the confrontation was coming, and when it did, the truth, every sharp, unvarnished word, would finally have to be spoken. It was a Saturday evening when the phone rang. My neighbor's voice was tight with concern. "Eleanor, I hate to trouble you, but there's a commotion at the mansion. Cars lined all down the lane. Music blasting. Young people everywhere." "Did you know?" My heart sank. I hadn't invited anyone. I hadn't agreed to anything. I slipped on my coat and drove back to the house, headlights catching the sea of cars that crowded the gravel drive. The front doors, Margaret's heavy oak doors, were flung wide open, letting waves of pulsing music pour into the night. The air smelled of beer and smoke. As I stepped inside, the sight nearly broke me. Strangers lounged on the antique settees, drinks sloshing over fabric Margaret had chosen herself. Someone leaned against the grand piano, leaving damp rings from their glass on its polished surface. Laughter, shrill and careless, echoed off the walls. My sanctuary, my sister's legacy, was being trampled as though it were nothing but a stage. And at the center of it all stood James, glass in hand, his voice booming above the crowd. "Welcome to my future home," he announced, beaming as his friends cheered. Something inside me stilled. Not anger, not grief, something colder. A final line had been crossed. I stepped forward, my heels firm on the marble. At first no one noticed. Then, slowly, faces turned toward me, whispers rippling through the room. The music pounded on until I spoke, my voice steady and low. "Everyone out, now." The command cut through the noise like a knife. Silence spread. Cups lowered. The music faltered and died as someone fumbled for the controls. James spun around, disbelief flashing in his eyes. "Grandma, what are you doing? You can't just—" "Out," I repeated, my voice even firmer. "This is not your house. This is not your stage. Get out." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, hesitantly, the first few guests shuffled toward the door. Others followed, murmuring apologies. Within minutes, the room thinned, leaving only James and his closest friends, their bravado evaporating under my gaze. James slammed his glass down on the table, the liquid splashing onto the lace runner. His face was flushed with humiliation. "You can't embarrass me like this in my own house," he shouted, his voice raw. The words rang in the air, heavy with entitlement. My own house. He believed it still, even now. I reached into my bag, fingers brushing the familiar weight of folded paper. Slowly, deliberately, I drew out Margaret's letter and the legal documents I had guarded for years. I opened the letter, my voice clear as I read aloud. "This mansion belongs to the Whitfield Family Trust. My sister Eleanor may reside within it for the rest of her natural life. Upon her passing, the property shall serve as a refuge for families in need, as is my greatest wish." The words filled the room, heavy and undeniable. A hush fell. James's friends glanced at one another, their faces pale. I lifted my eyes, meeting James's stunned gaze. His skin had gone white, his jaw slack. "You see," I continued, my voice calm but cutting, "this was never mine to give. And it was never yours to take. Margaret built this place on love and sacrifice, and she entrusted me only with the responsibility of guarding it until the time came." James staggered back a step, his confidence cracking. "That's not— No, that can't. Everyone knows. Everyone knows what you wanted them to believe," I said sharply, "that you were destined to inherit. That you were the rightful heir. But the truth was here all along, in these words, in Margaret's hand. This house belongs not to you, James, but to those who need shelter, those who will walk these halls with gratitude, not arrogance." He shook his head, eyes wide, as though trying to will away the truth. "You lied to me." "You let me think. I never lied," I said firmly. "I tried to tell you." "You refused to listen." For a moment, the room held nothing but his shallow breathing, the papers trembling in my hand. Then I delivered the final blow. "You thought this house was yours, but it never was. And neither was my love, James, not anymore. Because somewhere along the way, you stopped cherishing it. You traded it for greed, for entitlement. You made me invisible." His face crumpled, anger and shame warring across his features. His friends slipped quietly from the room, unwilling to witness more. We were left standing there, just the two of us, the grandmother who had once held his hand, and the man who now saw her only as a bridge to stone walls. I set the keys on the table between us. Their metallic clink rang out in the silence. "These," I said softly, "are not ownership. They are responsibility. I have carried them with care, because they meant Margaret trusted me to protect this place. They do not belong to you. They never will." I lifted the photo album from my bag, placing it beside the keys. The images of his childhood stared up at us, his jam-stained smile, his small hand curled into mine. "This," I whispered, touching the album, "was love, my love for you. Love that once meant more than anything I could hold in my hands. But you ignored it. You chose bricks and mortar over the heart that raised you." Finally, I laid the letter gently atop the pile. "And this," I said, my voice steady, "is truth. Margaret's truth, my truth. The truth you refuse to see." James stood frozen, eyes darting between the keys, the album, the letter, the weight of it pressed down on him, stripping away the bravado, the careless arrogance. "You ruined everything," he whispered hoarsely. "No," I replied, rising to my full height. "You ruined what could have been between us. The house was never yours to lose. But my love, my trust, that was yours to keep, and you threw it away." He had no answer. Only silence, broken by the sound of his shallow breaths. I gathered the papers, the album, the keys, and turned toward the door. My dignity, long bruised, rose up around me like armor. For the first time in years, I felt the strength of Margaret's words echoing in my bones. Our family's strength is in love, not walls of stone. Behind me, James's voice cracked, small and desperate. "Grandma, please." But I kept walking, the echo of my steps carrying me out into the night. The mansion stood behind me, quiet now, stripped of music and laughter. Not a possession, not a prize, but a promise. A promise Margaret had entrusted me to uphold, and I would. The echo of slammed doors still lingered in Eleanor's ears after James stormed out of the mansion, his girlfriend trailing behind with an embarrassed look on her face. For a long while, Eleanor just stood in the center of the great hall, her hand resting on the banister polished by generations. The silence after the chaos was heavy, but not suffocating. It was clarifying. By morning, word had already spread through the family. Cousins, nieces, and nephews began calling. Not one of them asked about the house, the inheritance, or the trust. Instead, their voices trembled with admiration. "Eleanor, you stood your ground with such grace. You reminded us what Margaret really stood for. We're proud of you." For years she had felt invisible, taken for granted by the very boy she once carried on her hip. Now, with the truth out in the open, it was as though a curtain had lifted. People saw her again, not as a gatekeeper to wealth, but as Eleanor, the sister, the aunt, the grandmother who had given love freely all her life. The following weeks brought a quiet transformation. Eleanor began working more closely with the trustees of the Whitfield Family Trust. She sat at the long oak table in the solicitor's office, surrounded by serious men in suits, and spoke with a clarity that surprised even herself. "This house mustn't be a relic of greed," she said, voice steady. "It must be alive with love." Margaret wanted it to hold families who had lost their footing, to give them shelter and hope. I intend to honor that. Plans took shape. Bedrooms once filled with dust would host children's laughter. The sprawling gardens she tended each morning would become spaces for healing. The mansion, instead of looming as a monument to wealth, would become a beacon of generosity. For the first time since Margaret's passing, Eleanor felt the house breathe again. One evening, after a long day of sorting through papers, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of her beloved morning tea, though now it was evening. Her gaze wandered to the drawer where the keys rested. Slowly, she pulled them out and laid them on the table. How many times had James eyed them, imagining them as the crown jewels of his future? To him they meant ownership, power, status. But as Eleanor turned them in her palm, she realized what they truly were: a responsibility, a trust, a symbol, not of wealth, but of care. With quiet finality, she placed them back in the drawer and closed it gently. For the first time, she didn't feel burdened by them. She felt free. She wandered to the bookshelf and took down the photo album. Dust clung to its cover, but she brushed it off tenderly. Page after page revealed James's boyhood, the gap-toothed grin when he'd learned to ride a bicycle, the proud moment he held up a book they'd read together, his small hand clutching hers on their way to Sunday service. Her eyes stung, but she didn't weep. Instead, she whispered softly, "You were loved. Always, even if you forgot." She closed the album and returned it to the shelf, not as a relic of loss, but as a testament to what had been true. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor found herself surrounded by people who valued her heart over her possessions. Distant relatives visited, not to covet the mansion, but to sit with her in the garden, to share tea and laughter. Neighbors stopped by with fresh bread and stories, grateful she had reminded them that community was stronger than greed. The mansion, once a shadow of contention, began to hum with life again. Painters, carpenters, and gardeners worked alongside volunteers. Eleanor, though frail with age, directed them with quiet joy. She felt Margaret's presence in every decision, as though her sister's hand rested on her shoulder, guiding her. And James? He did not return. Perhaps his pride kept him away, or perhaps the truth was too much to face. Eleanor did not chase him, nor did she close her heart entirely. She left the door open should he ever wish to come back, not for the house, but for her. Justice, Eleanor realized, was not loud or vengeful. It was quiet. It was knowing that the boy who had scorned her lost the very thing he craved, while she gained back her dignity, her peace, and her place within the family. On a bright spring morning, Eleanor stood on the mansion steps as children played tag across the lawn. Their laughter rang through the grounds, louder and purer than any party James had once imagined. She breathed in deeply, the scent of blooming roses filling her lungs, and smiled. The mansion had finally become what it was always meant to be, not a prize to be claimed, but a sanctuary of love. And Eleanor, with her gentle hands and quiet courage, was its true keeper. Eleanor sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, her eyes soft but steady. She spoke not to James, not to the mansion, but to those willing to listen. I thought losing my grandson's love was the greatest pain I would ever know. For years I told myself that maybe he was busy, maybe he'd come around. But what I learned is this: when someone values possessions more than people, they've already walked away from you, long before you ever notice the distance. Her voice carried the weight of years, but also the strength of survival. Love cannot be bought. It cannot be passed down in a will or hidden behind walls of stone. It must be nurtured, day by day, in the small kindnesses we show one another. That's what Margaret understood when she left the mansion for the trust. She knew walls crumble, but love endures. She looked toward the gardens where children's laughter would one day echo. The mansion will not be James's prize, nor mine to cling to. It will shelter families who know the value of love, families who will hold each other close when everything else falls away. And that, I think, is the truest legacy. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. And now I'll ask you, what would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have told him sooner, or let him learn the hard way? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.